Amatakiapi, Napechuzapi, Chantewashte. I greet every one of you, all my relatives, everyone who's joining us for this very special event that we're hosting tonight. It's the first of a many-part series called Friday Night Forums. I'm currently calling from Tiwa Territory, also known as Albuquerque, New Mexico. The Red Nation, in partnership with the Arab Resource Organizing Center, or AROC, and the Center for Political Education, is hosting this series of critical conversations on settler colonialism, US imperialism, and decolonization. And as we all know, we're all experiencing this right now. The COVID-19 pandemic is global. And so we believe, as progressive and left organizations, that our responsibility and our response to this crisis must also be global. So the Friday Night Forums feature anti-imperialist perspectives and lessons on organizing from around the world. We're not just going to focus on the United States, but we're also going to focus anti-imperialism not just in the context of the movements in the United States, but also looking at what other movements are doing throughout the world, but also with a keen eye towards decolonizing Turtle Island. And for those of you who are joining us and may not have read the press release, next week we will be doing a special seminar presentation on COVID-19 in Indian country. What are Indigenous communities doing in Indian country here in North America, and what can you do to help? On May 1st, we will be doing a panel on organizing workers. On May 8th, we'll be doing a panel on sanctions on Iran. On May 15th, Palestine and the blockade on Gaza. On May 22nd, the China and US relations. And then on May 29th, Abolition and the COVID-19 crisis. I also want to give a special shout out. Today is International Palestinian Prisoners Day. Please support the work of prisoners organizations such as Samadoun or Ademir, and we'll post those links in the chat. But just a solidarity with all the Palestinian prisoners. And without further ado, I'll introduce my panelist, Rachel Herzing, from the Center for Political Education, who will introduce herself after a short video from one of our comrades in Venezuela. Abril Viscaya is a militant of an artists movement from FRAPAM, which stands for Frente Revolucionario Artístico Patria o Muerte, that brings together artists of different artistic expressions committed to revolution. And this also includes musicians, dancers, poets, among others. And I had the fortunate opportunity of meeting Abril last October on an international delegation for the first meeting of Indigenous peoples in Venezuela, Indigenous peoples and social movements, as a representative from North America, and specifically as a representative from the Red Nation. And unfortunately, Abril cannot join us via live stream because of US sanctions and the really bad internet connection. So he was gracious enough to record this short video message that I'm going to play for you all right now.
Hi, my name is Abril Viscaya, and I am talking from Caracas, the capital city of Venezuela. In the next minutes, I will try to give you a summary of the last 30 days during the COVID-19 crisis. In Venezuela, the first cases were confirmed on March 15, and in that moment, the government took the decision to create a quarantine just in 8 states of the country. Those states were Apure, Táchira, and Zulia that are located in the border with Colombia, and the rest of those states were La Guaira, Miranda, Mujeres, and Caracas, the capital district. After 72 hours, about the measures that were taken. In the first place, all the massive meetings are forbidden, like music concert, sport events, political rallies and activities like that. In the economic area, we have the suspension of the payments for house lease, and also the suspension of labor activities and those related to the educative system, with the exception of those activities that involve medical care, food commerce, and also the security forces. Other important measures in this area is that the public and the private sector are compromised by the law to pay the wages to all workers during the time of the social quarantine. But we also have another means of social security, like the system called Patria. And this is a system that you have, where you have a web page where you register and give your information as a citizen for the statistics of the Venezuelan state. And right now it's really useful because you can receive through this system economic bonuses as part of the distribution of the national wealth. And it's also useful because the government create a web form that you have to fill about what's the situation of your health right now. How do you feel if you have felt the symptoms of the virus? You can fill it there and give your information, and then you will receive a visit of the national healthcare system. It has been really important, and the population has responded to all these policies with a really high social discipline, and the numbers are talking by themselves. For example, I have here some numbers about what's the development of the coronavirus here in our country. We have until now 189 confirmed cases, just 9 deaths, 110 recovered, and 70 active cases. Is the lowest rate in the entire region, and I think in the whole continent. All these numbers about the development of the coronavirus in our country can be confirmed in the webpage of the World Health Organization. But I would like to talk a little bit also about the geopolitical aspect of the moment, because we feel right now that we are in a really big danger, because the US administration on March 26th, in the voice of the General Attorney, gave a press meeting. The name of this General Attorney is William Barr, and he accused with the charges of drug trafficking to our President Nicolas Maduro, and offered a reward for him of $15 million. This is really dangerous because we know that this is a fake accusation, and it's really worldwide known that the origin of the drug trafficking is the Colombian territory, and they use the route of the Pacific Ocean and not the Caribbean Sea or the Atlantic Ocean. So it's just an excuse to create the conditions in the public opinion to make a military intervention. And we know that it's an old tactic, because they use it in Iraq, using as an excuse the weapons of massive destruction that they never found. And we all know that the cause of the war are the natural resources. In the Venezuelan case, is the oil. And we know that they are receiving the help and the support of the Colombian government. But the Colombian government are not just creating problems in a military aspect, and they are creating problems in a social aspect, because we have a lot of Venezuelan citizens living there, and right now they are coming back because they do not feel safe, and we have to create all a humanitarian operation there in the border. We are receiving them, we are testing all the persons that are crossing the border, and we are providing the transportation to their cities of origin, the shelter for them to spend the time of quarantine, because they have to be in quarantine at least 2 weeks to prevent the spread of the virus. So the United States administration is increasing and the threats against our country, not just with the economical sanctions and the blockade, but also with the threat of a military invasion. I have to highlight the participation of the working class and the grassroots organization, because it's really difficult to overcome the situation with all the shortages in daily life if you don't have a really well-organized political tissue inside the society. According to the statistics of the Ministry of Communes, we have created in the last 10 years more than 48,000 community councils and more than 3,000 communes across the country. And I can give you 2 examples, one in the urban area and one in the rural area, about how the communes are getting involved in this moment. In Caracas, we have a commune called Altos del Lídice, and this commune from the very first moment has been organizing the distribution of the gas cylinders for domestic use. They have been organizing the distribution of medicines for vulnerable population like elders and pregnant women. They have been working together with the club distributing food. The club is the local council for supplies and production, and so on. So they have been involved in a lot of activities, and I tell you that in the rural area we have a commune in the Lara state that is really well known. The name is Comuna El Maizal, and they have not stopped the production. They are producing, for example, vegetables. They are involved in agriculture, but they are also involved in the livestock, and they are producing cheese and milk, and they distribute this and they sell this with fair prices to the neighbor communities, and they don't fall into the logic of the market. So in this case, the people feel that the power is not something that is really far away, just they're in the structure of government. They feel that the power is near to them because they feel that when you are organized, when you're a community, you are the power. And that is really important in this moment in the construction of socialism, in the construction of the Bolivarian socialism. I don't want to forget the international solidarity and the support that we have received from countries like China, Cuba, and Russia. They have sent to us medical teams with experts. They have sent to us more than 100 tons of medical supplies that include gloves, includes protection suits, masks, and dozens of thousands of PCR tests. So it's really important for us to feel that not every country in this world are interested to develop a diplomacy of war, and in the other side, it's important to us to know that we can count with the solidarity of different peoples and governments.
I would like to tell Mr. Donald Trump to take his thoughts and claws out of Venezuela. This is a free and independent country. It is not anybody's colony. All of us Venezuelans are asking that this man, who thinks he owns the entire world lift the sanctions against the people.
Let me tell you, Mr. Trump, this is a country where we have been fighting battles since the time of Bolivar, but we have won all these battles, and we're going to keep on winning. Mr. Trump, take your hands off Venezuela. We are sick of you. We are fed up. We are a country of peace. We are a country of progress. Our president has a nation that supports him, that backs him. So, Mr. Trump, take your claws out of Venezuela. Take your claws off our children. Take your claws off our country. Take your arrogant eyes off our country. Mr. Trump, enough is enough.
Today, more than ever before, during this pandemic that has taken over the world, we ask the people, the blessed people of the United States, and each and every person who lives in the country, we ask for your support. We ask that you ask your government to stop the sanctions and the economic sabotage against our country.
I would like to ask the honorable, noble people of the United States to raise your voices and to demand an end to sanctions against Venezuela.
I call upon the people of the United States to wake up and protest against American imperialism, which is led right now by Donald Trump, but which many previous presidents have participated in, bringing death and desolation to many countries. It's not a time for threats or blockades. It's a time for solidarity. It's a time to be together, to work for the peoples of the world. We want peace.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Rachel Herzing, and I'm from the Center for Political Education. We're really grateful to be participating tonight and bringing this to you with the Red Nation and Arab Resource and Organizing Center. I want to introduce Carolina Morales, who's going to be our next presenter. I'm especially excited to introduce Carolina because she's one of our community advisors at the Center for Political Education and a huge help to our work overall. She is a queer migrant from Venezuela who's been living in the San Francisco Bay Area and working in community wellness and social justice for over 16 years here. Carolina dedicated a decade of organizing to support queer and transgender survivors of violence to heal from trauma, to challenge criminalization, and practice community accountability. As an advocate for equity and racial justice, she has advanced policy campaigns with unhoused communities, immigrants, and formerly imprisoned and detained people. She's currently a Master's of Social Work student, and could not be more pleased to have Carolina with us tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Carol.
Great. Thank you for the invitation to the Red Nation movement and to our Resource and Organizing Center, and for the Center for Political Education to always support and be part of important events that bring perspectives that help us, invite us to kind of open our gaze beyond our local communities. Thank you also for tuning in. I know it's Friday night and there is so much you could be doing. That's a bad joke on the pandemic. So to position myself a bit, I am Venezuelan. I came to the US when I was 17 years old. My family is all still in Venezuela. And I am lucky that, especially in the past 3 or 4 years, I've been able to travel twice a year and visit family, friends, and comrades in Venezuela. So what I'm going to share with you both comes from my visits and from what friends and family share with me. And some also research and fact searching. And one of the things that I want to share also to contextualize is that it's useful for me to compare the California reality sometimes with the Venezuelan reality, because, you know, we're somewhat similar in population size. Politically, California, you know, we like to think that we're pretty progressive. And so at times I think that's been helpful for me, because when organizers try to compare the entire reality of the US, it's like completely inappropriate. Even comparing California, I think it's somewhat inappropriate, but bear with me in terms of some of my comparisons in the realities. So because tonight we are within the framework, the conversation is within the framework of COVID-19, I want to share one of the reasons why I think it's important to learn about Venezuela. For example, if we look at numbers of cases and number of people who've passed away due to COVID-19, in California, we have 12 up to, these are numbers from yesterday, April 16th. In California, we have 27,000 cases with 879 deaths due to COVID so far. And we have a 39 million population. In Venezuela, there are, and it's in the whole other end of the spectrum of the numbers that I have, in Venezuela, there are 197 cases as of Thursday, with 9 people who've passed away. And we have 28 million people in the country. And also, mind you, we don't have the amount of resources that the United States has. And we've been going through an economic crisis and have sanctions and a lot of different like structural challenges. If we look regionally, Ecuador, that currently has a neoliberal government, right after President Correa, who was an ally to President Chavez and President Maduro. In Ecuador now there are 7,000 cases, 7,800, so almost 8,000 cases, with 388 deaths. And the population there is 17 million, so smaller than Venezuela. In Colombia, there are 3,000 cases so far and 131 deaths. And they have about a population that's actually bigger than California. It's 50 million people. And I think these are numbers that are important to remember as we continue discussing the reality in Venezuela and in the region. To add a little bit to what Abril Viscaya was saying in the video in terms of Venezuela's response to COVID-19, the Maduro administration, as he said, is leveraging the Carnet de la Patria system, or System de la Patria, that is a part of the infrastructure that was created to try to look at the needs of the population overall. And it's a voluntary system, right? So it's a system that the administration has been inviting people to join and to input their information in order to understand who needs jobs, what kinds of jobs or training they need to get the jobs that they want, who in schools needs supplies, how many people are in your family so you can receive certain bonuses, which we call it bonuses in Venezuela, but it's basically cash assistance at different points. So now it's being leveraged for cash assistance during COVID-19, which is what Abril said, what Abril called bonuses. And in this Carnet de la Patria, people right now are being invited to self-report symptoms related to COVID-19, any symptoms that they think that may be related, and then doctors come to your home to give you a test. So I think that that's really critical in terms of how is this country prioritizing resources versus the US, and in particular in California, which is where I reside, and I reside specifically in San Francisco. You know, there has been all this talk of, wow, how great California, because we have, you know, we're flattening the curve. And yes, I think, you know, there are some things that we can celebrate in terms of trying to take care of each other and staying in and paying attention to what health science says. And I think given the amount of resources that we have, we shouldn't have in the Bay Area 185 deaths so far, and in California 879, when Venezuela has been able to just have 9 people pass away from the disease. There are fewer cases of community transmission because people are adhering at stay-at-home orders, and also they have been relying a lot more on organizing, on social organizing, right, on systems of grassroots organizing. Like, for example, the communal councils are helping deliver food to people, are helping figure out what are needs that are really critical for that specific area where the council is located. And those pieces are really helping as well. And in another great thing that the Maduro administration was able to do, besides freezing rents, as Abril mentioned, what he meant freezing leases, freezing rents, also outlawed job dismissals as a result of the quarantine. So there cannot be anybody fired due to the quarantine. Telecommunication companies, so internet, phone, are barred from cutting services to anyone for 6 months. I know that just this morning while I was in school, a couple of my students lost internet and they had to join by phone. Thank goodness they had phone. But right, we have so many stories here of people that don't have access to basic communication needs that's preventing them from either working or going to school or communicating with family, not being isolated, etc. Another part of the response included adding 4,200, so 4,200 temporary hospital beds. And a lot of those were obtained through an agreement with hotels. So I thought that was important to mention because in San Francisco, where I am, there has been a fight for about 2 weeks between the Board of Supervisors and the mayor to try to house our 7,000 houseless people that live on the streets. We have 14,000 people that are unhoused. 7,000 of them live in shelters, and 7,000 live on the sidewalks, on the streets. Very at risk, very vulnerable populations, and yet we can't get ourselves to prioritize their health. Another part of the response has included improving and having more products in the CLAP boxes. So these are kind of like the food assistance that gets delivered to your home through the communal council system that right now serves 24 million people. So it's mostly low income and middle income people. And wanted to also add, in terms of, as we compare some of the lies in the media with the reality, right? Oh, Venezuela is such a dictatorship, and yet Colombia and Brazil, the first thing they did as soon as they found cases in their countries was close the borders to anybody going into the country. And Venezuela did not. In fact, we focused on making sure that people inside of the country were okay, and that we had enough infrastructure to care for people despite the sanctions. And yet Colombia and Brazil, even though they closed their borders, they did not focus on their populations and have had increased number of cases. And so I think that that's important to mention, right? As we think about borders and migration. And amidst this global pandemic, the US decided to escalate politically and militarily their threats and intimidation towards Venezuela. And this is the piece that really moved me even more to be part of this conversation, why I'm so grateful that this was the first conversation in the series, because we are in a vulnerable state in Venezuela. There is a lot of difficulty to buy any goods, from food to medications to vaccines. And right now, when not only Venezuela is vulnerable, but the entire world is going through a crisis, it is completely absurd that Trump is making direct moves to position military forces and a media narrative that would support a possible war. So on March 26th, as Abril said, when we were on the second week of shelter in place in California, the US Department of Justice announced false charges of terrorism and drug trafficking against President Maduro, and offered $15 million for his apprehension. We all know that when you are talking about the president of a country and apprehending them, this really means $15 million for his head, right? Like that's just pretty clear to me, at least, right? This is not somebody who like just lives in the corner building next to somebody that's just gonna be, arrested easily. So that is, to me, kind of like the clearest sign of escalation militarily. And if there are any doubts, then he sent an even more clear message. So the Pentagon deployed military contingents near the coast of Venezuela, while also deploying US military personnel in Colombia near the border. And all of this deployment was under the disguise of an anti-drug trafficking action in the Caribbean. To make matters even worse, the Pentagon sent US Navy destroyers, littoral combat ships, Coast Guard cutters, helicopters, patrol planes, amongst others. And all of this at the same time as troops are being withdrawn from Iraq. I don't think that's a coincidence. And as was mentioned also by Abril, I think it's very ironic that there is all of a sudden all this conversation about Venezuela being a drug terrorist state, when it is well known and it's been well documented for decades that most of the production of substances occurs in Colombia and Mexico, and most of the consumption occurs in the US, right? It takes place in the US. And I want to now move a little bit into contextualizing what's happening in Venezuela by understanding what has happened in the region. especially given the phenomenon of Guaidó, or white dog, how he's called in Venezuela. So one of the main kind of claims for illegitimacy in the recent years against Maduro has been that supposedly there was electoral fraud in 2018 when Venezuela held their last presidential elections. So during those elections in May 2018, the claims of fraud were also followed by the fact that the Venezuelan opposition requested the UN to not send international observers to the elections. Venezuela, for the past 20 years, has had very transparent election processes that have been well celebrated and well regarded throughout the world for many reasons. One of the reasons is there are hundreds of international observers that come to Venezuela every time. And it's very interesting, you know, that the opposition worried about electoral fraud asked the UN to prohibit international observers from going to Venezuela. I think we can continue to kind of connect the dots around the right in the US, the right in Venezuela, right? There is a very similar script that the right wing has. Henry Falcón was the main candidate running for president against Maduro, representing opposition forces. He was actually expelled from his right-wing party called the MUD because of running, which actually created a lot of tension in the opposition from the more extreme right-wing forces that expelled him for running, and who also said that nobody in the opposition should come out and vote, that they should not exercise their right to vote. Because again, they were afraid of electoral fraud. And not only he was expelled, the White House threatened personal sanctions against him for running. And here in San Francisco, during elections, presidential elections in particular, you can vote in your consulate. Well, now not anymore, because we don't have consulates or an embassy in the United States because Trump kicked everybody out. But during that last election, when people were able to vote, what happened was I know Venezuelans. Most of the Venezuelans I know here are part of the opposition, and they were calling each other and calling also those of us who are not part of the opposition to say that if anybody got anywhere near the consulate, that they would get physically assaulted, that they would get beat up. And that's the same thing that I heard from my friends on the ground in Venezuela, that people were being personally threatened for wanting to exercise their right to vote. With all of these problems, there was still an election, and 31% of eligible voters casted their ballots, same number of people as the last Obama presidential election. And I can't remember if also Trump, I don't know how many people voted in that election. And Maduro wins by 67% of the votes. Another one of the electoral fraud claims that the right has every single time, not just this last election, is that a lot of non-Venezuelans can vote. And what they mean by that is that the Venezuelan government has given IDs to Colombian and Ecuadorian immigrants who've been part of the makeup of Venezuela for years. And they're exerting, you know, their xenophobic I guess, opinions onto their analysis of electoral fraud, right? So they keep complaining using this xenophobic rhetoric around everybody and their mother can vote and it's not fair. So moving right along, he wins. There is somewhat some peace for a few months. And in fact, that summer when I went, some friends of mine were discussing how they were worried that in January of the following year, that they were expecting something was gonna be done, that the right was gonna do something to try to, Rachel, oh my goodness, thank you, 2 minutes. Oh my goodness, and I'm not even halfway. Beautiful. So Guaidó comes out of nowhere and declares himself president in January 2019, minutes after Mike Pence sends a video where he begins speaking Spanish, expressing support for Guaidó. So this was a very concerted effort that at the time they denied. Later on, the whole truth came out that, of course, they were coordinating these efforts between the White House here in the US and Venezuela. And it's been now proven that USAID, so USAID, gave Guaidó $200 million last year to rebuild the economy and the country. And that actually also caused a lot of tension in the opposition because, of course, some people got the money and some people didn't. And all of this was happening while in Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and Ecuador, there were uprisings against neoliberal governments, including, as we know, right, the protests that were happening in Chile, in Ecuador, for example, which we were talking about, the cases, right, the incredible amount of cases of COVID-19 there. The new president, President Moreno, revoked a decree that eliminated fuel subsidies and led to a struggle between the government and indigenous organizations. And that sparked a series of uprisings. And in the last part of the year, we heard how in Colombia there were also uprisings against the neoliberal government. And now I'm trying to figure out where to move in the last few seconds. So on the ground, what the sanctions have looked like is an inability to buy medications, inability to buy paper to print bills. So that was a big deal in the past 2 years, with people not having cash to pay for stuff, materials to print passports, materials to refine petroleum to produce gasoline, so shortage of gas. Also problems accessing vaccines like for malaria and measles, which we didn't have those two illnesses as problems in our country anymore. And in the past year and a half, there's been a slow spread again. And even though we have all these monetary problems because of the sanctions, the US government is so blatant in their desire to get this Guaidó guy to have any kind of power that he was given the assets that Citgo, our oil company based in the US, has, and that amounts to $10 billion. We have no idea what's happening with that money and how it's being used. And, to close, I can't wait for all of the questions that you may have in the Q&A, but I really want to do a plug for support the end of sanctions, to continue looking for ways to work together, to understand that the migrant and refugee crisis here is connected to our, the US foreign policies, our houseless crisis in California and in the US, There are so many solutions that we can learn from countries like Venezuela, who have built millions of homes in a span of like a decade with very little money. The occupation of Palestine and their decades-long resistance has so much to teach us now during COVID-19, right? Like, what are the ways in which we can really learn from each other? And I want to close with an ask to write statements of support with groups, with organizations, with your household. Sign petitions. Code Pink, at least every month, has a different petition, and their petitions are really good, and they tend to organize good international kind of solidarity actions in term with connected to Congress and legislators at the federal level. Follow organizations like the Center for Political Education, the Malcolm X grassroots movement, the AROC, the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, the Red Nation, and let's continue inviting our friends and family to care about international solidarity issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina, for all of that. That was really great and very important, I think, for all of us to hear. I want to start by just following up on this last bit that you were talking about. One of the questions that's come through is about specific actions that people can take. So you talked about writing statements, you talked about petitions. There are people, I think, on tonight, not just from the United States. We might have, I think, Maori comrades with us tonight, maybe from other places as well. So if there are asks that you have of specifically the people on tonight, is there like a specific thing that you want to promote? We would love to hear that. If there's any addition, just to kind of draw that last bit out, how can we be spurred into a little bit of action?
So I know Code Pink has a new effort to collect signatures. So if you go on their website, I think that's where you can find the new petition. And in this one, I think it's really appropriate because it's actually signing to ask the US to help the people within the US with COVID-19 and to fight the war against COVID-19, not a war against Venezuela, given all of these acts. So I think that that's a very specific thing that we can all do tonight.
So the next question would be, do you know, so in the United States, there's been a lack of availability for testing. And so the question is, what is the availability of testing in Venezuela? Who can get tested? How many people have been tested?
That's a great question. What I know is, because we don't have a lot of resources and we have been dependent on donations from Cuba, Russia, and China, we haven't had enough tests to be able to test everybody or a big chunk of people. So folks that show symptoms are the ones that are tested. And as I mentioned, teams from the health system actually come to their homes, not like here. Like I have Medi-Cal, which is Medicaid, and I still, thank goodness I'm not sick, but I've been trying to figure out how would I get a test if I needed one, and I have no idea. In there, you log into a site that everybody knows. You can say I have symptoms and people come to your home. And I saw on the news yesterday that Maduro is in conversations with Iran, another country suffering from US sanctions, to try to strategize on how to find more tests, because the Maduro administration wants to test 10 million people in Venezuela to figure out how to move forward in, kind of like releasing people from the semi-lockdown that they're in.
speaking of the semi-lockdown that people are in the United States, we've been seeing increased use of policing to, monitor and also to punish people who are not observing stay-at-home orders. Are we seeing anything similar from Venezuela, or are Venezuelans taking other measures to try to encourage people to stay home?
Thank you. Yeah. So I love that I say we, like I live there. So in Venezuela, folks are not getting arrested for not wearing masks, for example, or not being cited either. But what authorities are doing is they are basically scolding people in public. So if, for example, I heard of a story of a group of young people that were playing basketball. It was like 17 young people playing basketball in a court without any face coverings whatsoever. And they were all given this like long speech on COVID-19 is very serious. Look at how this is going to affect your family. This is not okay. And so they had to kind of hear this long talk, and then everybody was sent to their homes. Also, some folks are being asked to like stand with like signs, on the sidewalk that say, I am not adhering to the, stay at home orders and left my house to go visit somebody. So they're looking for ways to educate the public that does not rely on putting people in jail or citing them and giving them any kind of, fees that nobody can pay. And I think that that's been an interesting take on that.
In a speech that Mike Pompeo gave last year to a group of oil lobbyists, one thing that he really pointed out and implored countries not to do is to accept Cuban internationalism through their medical doctors. And as we saw in places like Brazil, Cuban doctors have been persecuted and actually expelled from the country following the coup, the right-wing military coup, or US-backed coup in Bolivia. You saw the Áñez government expelling Cuban doctors, and now many of these Cuban doctors were working in kind of isolated, indigenous-dominated regions where healthcare was really inaccessible. And now we see Cuban doctors going to Spain, going to Italy, but also working with Chinese doctors on developing a vaccine. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between Cuban medicine and specifically socialist medicine in Venezuela, and that relationship and that partnership with Cuba.
Yeah, I mean, that partnership has been critical throughout the years in so many ways, and specifically now with COVID-19, it's been really important because it has allowed to build upon that infrastructure, right? That community-based model of having offices of doctors entrenched in the most vulnerable communities, the most working class communities in the country, and particularly in Caracas, where there is such a concentration, and right now it's where most of the cases are. And so it's been really, really critical, and I'm really grateful for the Cuban government and that that exchange that's there. And if that answers all of the parts of your question.
So one of the other things that has come through the questions is the question about the kind of media blackout that we know exists in the United States on all things Venezuelan. So what we get is a very particular perspective of life in Venezuela and kind of what that means. do you have any tips or ideas about ways that people can educate their personal networks, but also counter, you know, that kind of distorted story that's coming out of Venezuela?
Yeah, thank you. That one is always so hard. Because like even Telesur, I was, remembering how I was trying to access Telesur once from a government computer when I had my government job, and the computer wouldn't let me, and IT had to come and was saying that I was trying to access a dangerous site. I'm like, what do you mean? Yeah, it's from a dangerous country. And I'm like, dude, you know I'm from Venezuela. Like, what are you talking about? But, you know, Telesur is a great resource. Telesur, they have both English and Spanish news. Please access that. Venezuela analysis. What's great about Telesur, another plug about Telesur, is that they're really looking to unite the region through communications, something that other regions have done, right? Europe gets to do it all the time, but somehow, because we are doing it in South America, all of a sudden that's a bad thing, right? I've heard all this stuff about Telesur being a propaganda channel. Venezuela analysis, it's another good source. I'm also part of a couple of newsletters. One is called Resumen, and its news are in English, or Resumen is summary. And another one by William Camacaro, who is a compa who does some disability rights work. He's based out of New York, but he's from Venezuela, and actually right now he's still in Venezuela. And he organizes delegations, and he has a very good newsletter. So I can try to figure out with him how to, maybe through CPE and Red Nation and AROC, if you're open to it, how to send some kind of invitation for people who want to join those newsletters. But it's hard, you know. I think it takes like a lot of mind work and a lot of analysis to try to understand where is the uprising and what is the history of that country and what's the act that we're seeing portrayed in the media here as it connects to who the president is or who's the group in power, or right, all this complicated things. So it makes sense that we're all confused. If I am sometimes confused when I go many months without checking in with people, I start getting confused. Imagine how, you know, average folks are gonna feel. Like, it makes sense.
And just a final question before we wrap up. What is the likelihood of a ramped up on the ground military aggression under the cover of this crisis, specifically thinking about the training exercises that are happening in Colombia right now, and even the United States' relationship with the Colombian government, and thinking about the blockade that currently exists? What is the likelihood of something of a military action actually unfolding?
I fear that there is a big likelihood. I hope that I am wrong. And my fear comes from exactly what you mentioned, right? Also, a few weeks ago, there was an ex-military man from Venezuela who was in Colombia at the border with Venezuela and was found with an arsenal, and he was training a group of other men. We don't know on what, but we can make assumptions, right? And then once he was detained by the Colombian authorities, he said that he had a contract with Guaido and that he was working with Guaido. And then days later, guess who came to pick him up? The United States. So now he's here in US soil. So between that and the fact that they sent all these many different, I don't know what the words are of military things. So, right, they sent all these ships and helicopters and whateverness, and And on top of it now, Trump is like defunding the World Health Organization, right? So trying to silence anybody who would stand for vulnerable people suffering from this disease at this time, has put a number of dollars to the head of Maduro. The Pentagon sends all these Navy ships. To me, that is, that creates a high likelihood of a military attack and invasion in the moment when we're the most vulnerable.
Well, thank you so much, Carolina. And I also just want to give a shout out to Abril, Viscaya, who's actually on the line. He's calling in from Venezuela, it looks like. So definitely revolutionary salutes to our comrades there, and much love to everyone who's there. We, this forum is part of a series of forums that we're going to be having over the next couple of months. For those of you who weren't able to join us earlier, we went over the list, but it's increasingly important, as both of our panelists, presenters today talked about and emphasized, that this pandemic is being used, the cover of the crisis is being used to escalate military aggression against Venezuela, but not only Venezuela, but to escalate aggression through sanctions against countries like Iran. So we can't just, focus on the national context of the United States, right? That's just called American exceptionalism, let's be honest. Our perspectives, our goals, and our platforms and our movements have to be global, because this is a global pandemic that's affecting the entire world. And the world as we know it is going to be fundamentally changed coming out the other end. And so we encourage everyone on this call to join us. Here are some of the Twitter handles for the organizations that are sponsoring this: the Center for Political Education, AROC, the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and of course the Red Nation. You can follow the hashtag of Hands Off Venezuela, as well as hashtag Friday Night Forums. We'll be returning next week with a special panel on COVID-19 in Indian country. And if you'd like to continue to support this work, you can go to the link above, which is just therednation.org/support. That's therednation.org/support. And I promise we'll be working out the kinks on our live streams. And hopefully we can have more people who join in on the webinars themselves. And I want to thank everyone who participated. Thank you, Rachel, for being a wonderful moderator. Thank you, Carolina, for this excellent breakdown of what's happening in Venezuela. And also thank you, Abril, for sharing your story. We will be following up with people who registered for this webinar on how to register for the next webinar, and some of the resources that you can follow up on, whether it's Code Pink or whether it's looking at the sanctions campaign and what you can do about it in your local community, but also in your state or wherever you're calling from. So we want to thank you again for joining us this evening on a Friday night. I wouldn't be doing anything else other than sitting here with you. So I want to send, physically distant, but social solidarity to everybody who's out there and struggling in this moment in time. And it's important that we get the correct ideas out there on what's happening in Venezuela, the correct information, and know how best we can support our comrades in struggle. So thank you again for joining us, and good night.